you. Thank you everyone for coming. My name's Joe Doak. I'm Vice Chair of the Dorchester Civic Society. It's great this evening to welcome Pauline Crump, who is also now a member of Dorchester Civic Society, although she has a long history of involvement in various things, including the Weymouth Civic Society. And it's great to have members from Weymouth coming along this evening as well. And our relationship with Weymouth Civic Society is something that we have had some fledgling interaction with, but I think in the future we will certainly be planning to do more with Weymouth. Indeed, in a week's time we're going up to Salisbury to have a walkabout in Salisbury with Salisbury Civic Society. So these kind of interactions are just good, I think, for the whole interaction that occurs in Dorset and Wiltshire. Pauline is talking about social housing and the model that has been developed in Vienna. And Pauline's given me some biographical details. And it's interesting enough that Pauline is an Austrian citizen since last year. So well done for that. You're European, like we all are. And she is descendant from a persecuted ancestor. And she's very proud to be the daughter of an asylum seeker and an economic migrant from Austria. Had to leave Austria in 1930s, and we all know what was happening in the 1930s in Germany and Austria. He had to leave because of his political involvement in the opposition to the overthrow of the democratic government there. So again, a very significant historical moment which your family were involved in. So significant there. Her mother, interesting enough, German born, but grew up in Austria. And she, Pauline's mother, was a very capable professional cook. Something that Pauline has developed skills in as well. So I'm looking forward to being invited for some food sometime. Pauline first visited Vienna herself in 1954 to meet members of the family there. But in terms of her career, she's basically been in education with an interest in history, so that she's undertaken a number of positions, including working at Weymouth College. And indeed, she did an MA in 1988 to 91, which had a dissertation, a special subject, looking at the British refugee organisation which rescued political and Jewish refugees from Prague. So again, she's obviously developed an interest in these kind of political movements going on. Like I said, she's been involved in a number of voluntary and political organisations, both local to us, but also international. And like I say, recently she has been involved with Weymouth Civic Society, where she was chair of the planning committee with Weymouth. A very valuable skill which we can draw upon in Dorchester. The final bit of the bio I found very interesting because she is also a lifelong supporter of Luton Town, which goes back to early years and her father's influence. Luton Town, of course, now in the Premiership, so have hit the big time. Let's hope they stay there. Anyway.
Well, they're playing tonight, so if anyone can keep an eye on the score, I'll be very grateful.
We'll get buzzed in on that, do it. So I'm going to hand over to Pauline, and she will take the talk forward. At the end of the talk, there'll be time for questions to raise. I'm sure there'll be potentially some lively discussion about how to do social housing, a very topical issue given our current housing crisis in this country. Over to you, Pauline. Thank you.
I quite like talking about my family background, but it's actually quite relevant to this because the political aspects of this were very fraught in the 30s. I'll be talking about how the Austrian social housing was funded, and that was very controversial and led to the problems that affected my father. So I've got skin in the game, as they say. So you're going to get a history lecture tonight, I'm afraid. I can't sort of crack old habits. If you go back to the sort of late 19th century, most of you will know that the Habsburg Empire was tottering along on its last legs. It was brought down by the First World War. That was a huge, almost a precursor of the European Union with all kinds of different nationalities. Surprisingly liberal. They allowed quite a lot of freedom of language and that sort of thing. But it meant that there was a great mass of people flowing around the empire, and many of them from all sorts of different places landed up in Vienna. So there was a huge housing problem, as in Britain, and very similar. The second half of the 19th century saw massive growth in populations, and particularly populations in towns, and housing didn't. So housing in Vienna was very stressed, very difficult, and pretty awful. Vienna was known, TB was known as the Viennese disease. I would imagine that virtually every large city could have taken that label as well. But poor housing and so on made this really bad. Even so, there were proto housing movements even at that time. Private enterprise ones, not local government. But you've got, if you can move on, I think actually I've already jumped the first. So, first of all, this is modern Vienna. This is the Graben, one of Vienna's major shopping streets. The reason I started with this, because I've sort of jumped ahead a bit, the reason I've started with this is because this year, for the 8th out of the last 10 years time, Vienna was voted the most livable city in the world. This is according to the Economist, one of the Economist units, the Economist magazine that has a sort of international thing which does this survey. And cities all over the world are nominated and voted upon. And Vienna comes out top year after year. And the basis of that, there's a score out of 100. And Vienna and the top 10 are in the 90s. And the unit, and I'm reading it, it's the Economist Intelligence Unit. So Economist and Intelligence aren't two words that go together for me. The criteria for this, its factors include the quality of healthcare, education, the cultural scene, infrastructure, and so on. And I mean, if you look at that, and then you think of Oxford Street, Vienna is a wonderful city, and if you haven't visited, do go to visit. But the housing in Vienna is absolutely phenomenal compared to what we have here. I've got some figures. I'm not going to bore you with many figures, but I've got a few figures. Something like 80% of the Viennese population live in rental accommodation. Of that 80%, about 60%, 60% of the total is either directly municipal housing, or it is housing that is produced by what we would call housing associations. This is a post-Second War model that has developed where the Viennese municipality is still in control. They control rents, they control building standards, the architecture, all kinds of factors like that. And the housing associations have to keep within these parameters that Vienna lays down. Now, I said a model is not one that we can copy. So, that's a big disappointment straight up. Because, it's like the old Irish thing, if you want to know the directions, you don't start from here. This developed, the Viennese model developed immediately after the First World War, when Austria became a republic, a Bundesrepublik, a federal republic, and Vienna became a federal state and had a very large degree of independence. The city of Vienna, can we go to the next one, please? Expanded. You've got Vienna there, no sign of the Danube. The Danube actually follows, is that showing? I can't find it. It's sort of that line in the middle. I can't see the spot, but I hope so. You see where Donaustadt is, and on Döbling on the other side. That line down there is actually the Danube. The Danube is the Danube, the Donau Canal, which is an artificial waterway made out of it, and various other bits and pieces that go through the middle of Vienna, none of which are blue. These outer areas were added mostly in the between wars period, some before the First World War. But the Innenstadt, oh, I found it. The Innenstadt is the old core of medieval Vienna. Around it, the small, these are like our boroughs, these areas. The small area is the early expansion by the end of the 19th century, and that is surrounded by the Gürtel, which is a sort of ring road. And then outside are quite rural, in many cases, areas. Vienna, actually within the boundaries of Vienna, there are some quite significant areas of England. So if you've heard of the Heuwiger, the new wine which is drunk copiously in the autumn, they're actually, the wines are actually grown within the Vienna boundaries. So, can we go on to the next one? So, in the end of the 19th century, you got the development of these sorts of buildings. And these were called Basena. I think it's based on an Italian word, so I don't know how you but Basena, Basina the Void. And this one actually is the building where my father grew up. Those were his the windows of his windows of the flat that he lived in. These were buildings that were built by private entrepreneurs, rentiers who wanted to make money. They varied from places with single rooms of about 10 square meters to places that had flats with 2 rooms perhaps, or 3. Very few larger. They were called Basina houses because they had these things on the inner corridors. They were almost all based around a central airwell with a corridor going all the way around the interior with flats opening off it. And our flat, the family flat, was absolutely standard. You walked, the front door went straight into the kitchen. Beyond it were 2 bigger rooms which had the outer windows. Very high ceilings, quite spacious. It was obviously one of the bigger, better places. But no toilet, no running water apart from the basin outside originally. By the time I visited, my aunt had a toilet with a sort of shower over it, like a sort of wet room, and proper water and power and so on in the kitchen. But the beginning, it was very, very good, and were exploited so that quite often people slept in them in series. People called beddair, people who went to bed in the same rooms. And you could get in some of these tiny rooms, you could get up to 10 people going through that. So not surprisingly, the health situation was not good. And that led to the development of what became known as the seedling movement, settlement movement. There was quite a lot of open spaces, and these spaces, I mean, someone must have owned them, but they were not controlled very much. And families, before, but particularly after the First World War, families moved into these spaces, built these huts, dug a garden around them, which produced family food supplies, and they grew these things grew. It was estimated that by the end of the First World War, in the early years immediately after the First World War, something like 60,000 people were living in these sea-level settlements. Next one, please. To the extent that the authority, the Viennese authority, took an interest and began to develop them. So this was a siedlung, but an official one, with proper housing. I mean, almost had the look of a sort of rather upmarket castle, I think, in this country from that period. So these siedlungen, they weren't wild. What impressed the local authority was that the people within them, on the whole, regulated. They worked communally. They cooperated. So they formed a very good example of what was to follow. Next, please. The result was that the city authority, as it was established in the aftermath of the First World War, as Austria was finding its feet as a new republic for the first time. The emperor had gone in 1918. In 1921, I think, I'm not very good on the date. In 1921, Vienna was actually designated as a Bundesland, a regional authority with wider powers. And the local council, which had a very large Social Democrat majority, and then Vienna has always, or virtually always, been under the control of the Social Democrats, sometimes in coalition with other parties. I think the Greens are involved at the moment. But Vienna is a left-wing area. And the local authority, taking the pattern of these siedlungen, established the Siedlungsamt, the settlement office, to promote housing, and they set down some principles right from the start. One of them, they appointed a very famous architect, Adolf Loos, whose buildings, this is a famous roof building in the centre of Vienna. That is a mansion that he built for a very rich industrial couple in Prague, or just on the edge of Prague. And that he was also interested in interiors, and that was the interior of another building. This was an old chateau type building, which he redesigned from the inside. And you can see, I think, very strongly the post-First War style architecture that's coming through. So this internationally famous, already in the early 20s, this internationally famous architect was appointed by the Viennese authority to run the office for the development of local housing. And the principles were established that this housing would have high architectural standards and high building standards. It would include lots of open spaces, play spaces for children, and air spaces, so that you're getting away from the idea of overcrowded slums. The living spaces would be developed to provide services for the communities, to bring the communities together so that the people who lived there would find schools, libraries, kindergarten, all kinds of facilities. The early buildings were quite Spartan, if you like, compared to what we'd expect. Most of them, they were all built from the beginning with individuals with their own toilets, but most of them didn't have private bathrooms. And within these developments would be laundry rooms, bathrooms, like I can remember in Weymouth, the public baths for the people whose houses didn't have baths. So these sorts of facilities were provided within the developments on a communal basis for people to use. Can we have the next one? And this is the very first one, which is I can't remember names. So it's the Metzler style. Oh, they're all called Port, which is court. This labelling was a dig at the old monarchy, because of course the fourth was the royal palace. So all of these municipal housing, or virtually all of these municipal housing developments were labelled Port. So this was the very first one, quite a small one by latest standards. The Austrians were already used to living in flats, in apartment blocks. You saw the Bacina buildings. These were standard. They didn't have the sort of the English predilection for your own little patch. So what's that? 6 stories to 6 and a bit. So this was normal, but of course it means that you can get quite high density buildings. And then onwards you move more into the sort of style of building that's associated with Vienna development. Monolithic, very much the style of the recession, the Austrian development of art and architecture and all sorts of things that were very strong at that period. You've got this sort of quasi-classical features like the Roman arches and so on, and huge. But the buildings were designed so that while they were big, they weren't overpowering, because there was masses of space around them. There were always lots of trees. There were wide open green spaces within them, because they were usually designed to make a community. So they would have perimeters that were noticeable, that separated them from the next bit. Not fences, not walls, but the entrances and so on were designed to bring people together. And all this was deliberate and concerted to create an atmosphere. I mentioned it a few moments ago that the principles included high standard, a very high standard of aesthetic presentation. So this is just an entrance. Nothing special about this, just one of the entrances. All this sort of majolica work around it. Next one. Again, you've got this very characteristic kind of feeling. I think I like it, but I wouldn't want to see it really continue. You know, I like looking back at it, but it is a very sort of overpowering style. And this particular building really was overpowering. It's the longest, largest single, you can't call it a building because it's so big, it's a single sort of bit of housing, the unbroken housing. I've got the statistics here. 1,100 meters long, more than a kilometer long. So the phrase is the longest contiguous residential building in the world. 1,382 flats, housing about 5,000 people. It was designed by another famous architect, famous Austrian architect, Karl Ehn, E-H-N. And within it, there were nurseries, a range of medical facilities, a library, shops, cafes, meeting rooms, And then the laundries and bathhouses and so on. And one of the laundries now is a museum, which is well worth a visit. I've not been there, but I've seen some of the contents online and so on, and it's really interesting, showing what Vienna is doing. So this, does anyone recognise it? You know what it's called? Well, this is called the Karl Marx Book. And of course, I mean, we say Marx and we think of Lenin and Stalin and Russia, but that wasn't what was thought about then, because of course Marx was a major historian and sociologist of the mid-19th century, and his ideas do not necessarily lead to Stalinism without a lot of help from other kinds of interventions. So Marx, even after the Soviet revolution, Marx was still recognised as a major thinker. And many of the other buildings are named after other local politicians, philosophers, together, who were respected at the time.
You know when this was built?
It was started in 1927 and finished in 1930. So most of what I'm talking about in this section of the talk are in that sort of period, from the early 20s through up to the beginning of the Second World War. So how on earth? I mean, all right, Vienna was a Bundesland. How on earth is that fine? And that is the question that obviously stymies people today. And because Vienna had a very strong social democrat majority, and because it was a very prosperous city, those two don't seem to sort of gel all that well together, but they're both true. The government, the Viennese government, which had tax raising powers, the social democrat government simply went for a load of wealth. If you had a car, and of course in the 1930s you had to be $50 to have a car. If you had a car, you paid tax. If you had servants, you paid tax. If you had, I can't remember the whole list of things, but I think if you had a house with over an excessive number of rooms and so on, you paid taxes. The taxes weren't very great. They weren't massive on any single thing, but they brought in quite significant money. And then, of course, that's not a good of course, once the houses were built, they brought in rent. And then there were other sources of funds from the federal government, which went to all the men. So, although it was extremely expensive, and towards the end of the talk, I have got some figures. Although it was extremely expensive, it wasn't so much of a burden on any individuals. Well, I mean, the people who were paying taxes on their cars and their servants didn't take that view, and there was very considerable antipathy to those taxes. But nevertheless, the success of the buildings, because they were very popular, the success of the buildings meant that there wasn't, as far as I'm aware at least, any significant reaction. And the other principle is you needed to have a relatively low income to get one of these flats in the first. When I say relatively low, I mean relatively. By the standards of the time, people who were working but had a decent salary would still be eligible for a flat. Once you got a flat, you had it for life if you wanted it. As long as there were obviously penalties if people were utterly criminal or whatever. But you didn't get thrown out. You had security of tenants. Go on, just go on, because most of them. This is the internal court of the Karl Marx Book. and the next, the art. The one on your left is, I think, inspiration, and the other one is maternity, another thing, something like that. They were very uplifting, the decorations. One of these was on each of the main doorways. I just like the style of that doorway, and you've got just the standard style of balconies and so on. All of these were come after, and every flat had some external, access to external air and light, so you could actually get out, even if it was just for the water. What was I saying about the taxis? Although the taxis were unpopular, because people got into the flats and could stay there, their salaries went up. And as their salaries went up, they paid more. So you always paid a proportion of your salary, but not a massive one. When I was involved with the Anglo-Austrian Society, the chairman was an it had absolutely nothing to do with Austria except that he'd been British ambassador to Austria and had had a whale of a time, enjoyed it, so he took over the Anglo-Austrian Society. And I did the newsletter for them, and I wrote an article. This is what actually put me onto this housing. I wrote an article. I saw a thing in the Guardian about how Austria had been the most difficult city. I think it's 2017. One of the 8 of the last 10 years. And that the Guardian article was comparing the availability of rental houses to people in 2017 to London. So a nurse in Vienna was interviewed, and she rented one of the municipal flats. She could get a bus to her job in I think 20 minutes. The rent was something like 17% of her salary. And sort of how many people. So the popularity of these places, they never became ghetto. They had a wide range of people living in them. And this snooty ex-ambassador, when I wrote this article for the Anglo-Austrian newsletter, he read it and he said, he said, I never could understand why all these high-powered civil servants were still living in camps. It works. So nobody was forced out. Nobody felt that they would be mean by living there. So you've got a real social need and pleasant housing. And as I say, I grew up in Luton, and in my childhood, Luton had I think it must have been pushing a third of council housing. A huge council. And again, just they were full of ordinary families. They weren't poor people. My best friend at school actually was Jewish. Her father owned a fur factory. He made fur coats, and he and the family lived in the country. And again, they paid a reasonable rent. They paid a worthwhile rent. Another reason why these flats were so popular was that the council made sure that everybody knew who was providing them. Built by the municipality of Vienna in the years 1925 to 28, from the means, the money provided by the housing. So on the wall of every building that the municipality put up was wording more or less like that, saying, this is what we've done with your taxes. Even today, if you go into Austria or Germany or France, you'll see bridges and all sorts of things built with money from the EU. You barely saw that. which is why it was so easy to tell so many people that really, I'm straight on my subject, and if I'm offending anyone, I'm sorry, but I am Austrian. This gave people the idea of what they were getting for them. And that, if you're taking taxes off people, you've got to show what you're doing. Even in the 30s, Vienna was famous for its these sorts of things like the Karl Marx produced masses of international commerce, and local authorities over the world took notice. This was the famous, the plan and the model of the famous Forest Hill flat in Leeds. I can still remember going to Leeds and seeing them. We went down the road and there was this great arched doorway. Can we go to the next one? This is the view that I can remember seeing. So you came out of the station, went down the long road, and this was at the end of it. This is the internal court. Now look at that. Think back to that internal court that I've just showed you from the Karl Marx, and look at the difference. The original plans for the Forest Hill flats, have I got the notes here? They were supposed to have had, they were very impressed by the Viennese thing. They were supposed to have included a community hall with seating for 520 and stage and dressing rooms, 20 shops, indoor and outdoor swimming pools, a wading pool, extensive courtyards, gardens and play areas, a nursery and a communal laundry. And even they planned a mortuary. But virtually none of that was built. They built the flats, and they copied some of the innovations that they got from the Austrian plans, things like rubbish chutes, so that you could just put your rubbish in at the top and it would land up in the places where the caretakers could clear. But maintenance was poor. The original building methods, they imported some kind of industrial building method from France, which proved not very effective, so that there were major problems. By the end of 40 years, these were actually pulled down in 1978, so built in the 30s, but pulled down in 78. And the people who were in them were furious. There was an article that I pulled off the internet that was written 3 or 4 years ago, I think, interviewing people who lived in, and they said, despite the sort of bleakness, they were suited to live in. There was a good community feel. The flats themselves were comfortable. And in the article, the author was saying, well, if they'd managed to hang on for another 10 years, they'd probably have been refurbished. Do you remember the Park Hill flats in Sheffield? Where they really went down. Again, a very good idea, sort of streets in the sky and all these sorts of slogans. Didn't work out, again, poor maintenance and so on. But they were taken over with private money as well as public money, refurbished, and they are now extremely popular. Again, and providing first-class housing. So, can we go on? Effectively now, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to flick through some pictures. If we go to the next. The previous building was the Frederick Engels Hall. This is part of it. Again, it was almost as big as the Karl Marx Hall, but again, monumental in its design, almost like a fortress with great towers and things. This huge tower with the clock at the top was actually the Lord King. You have this sort of innovative use of architecture. I love the clock. I think the clock's fabulous. Next, please. The Social Democratic government of Vienna was not popular, particularly not with the Austrian fascist national government. In 1934, the government attempted to close down Parliament. There was an old law left over from the imperial times, which gave the emperor permission to close down. There had been a parliament, but the imperial parliament didn't have any power. So it didn't really matter when he closed it down. The central government, the national government, was as right-wing as the Viennese government left-wing. And saw there's a much more complicated political and historical background. But the central government wanted to crush the Viennese municipality to get them too popular. There was an uprising at the same time. The left rose. It was a proper planned to be a proper full-scale revolution, guns and all, that was going to overthrow the Austrian fascist government. This was sort of Italian Mussolini sort of fascism, not the even worse Nazi style fascism. The whole thing was completely undermined by the government forces knew exactly what was going on. The signal for this uprising was that the trams in Vienna went on strike, and at that point all the different cells, people in their cells, went off to their cellars and wherever to get their guns. If they had the guns, get their guns to stand up to the government, but because it was so infiltrated, most of them were sacrificed in the first figure it out. At which point the extreme right, that was even further right than the Austrian government, took over, assassinated the Prime Minister and set their own setup off. So you had this outflowing from Austria of the left wing fleeing from the aftermath of the failed revolution or uprising, and the right wing, because the right wing coup, which whatever, didn't succeed very well either. So there was quite a lot of those who had to get out because they would have been in jail otherwise, and they all fled to neighbouring countries. And it was at this point I kind of left Austria. Stripped of his Austrian nationality, because he's illegally in war. My grandma was Czech, my father was Czech speaking, so he ended up in Prague, which was the Czechoslovakia was one of the few democratic countries that were in Europe at that time, and he was in Prague for 4 years, from 1934 to 1938. He was quite excited because he was one of the back copies of the Austrian version of the Daily Herald. Quite a few of you might well remember the Daily Herald. The Social Democrat newspaper across the border, the teaching opera singers from the National Opera House, speaking German for the Czech ones and Czech for the German ones, so they sing the operas and so on. Plotting in the background, so that was how he spent the next few years. The government, not being satisfied with wiping the uprising out, decided that some of the remnants had holed themselves up in the Karl and it brought artillery and shells in, regardless of the fact that it was full of demons. This is some of the damage. This caused absolute outrage. Just a few sort of odds and ends. I can't read this from there, but this is a garden shed on one of the big estates. But essentially, it basically says this is a garden shed for the Viennese municipality's garden work for this estate. I mean, they labelled everything. Next one, please. We jump forward now to after the Second World War, and Vienna is still under social democratic government. Today they're in coalition with the Green Party. Again, they do things. They really do things well. In Europe, you have coalitions of separate parties. You don't have coalitions within the party. When you have 2.5 parties at an election, you're bound to have problems because you've got such a range of different things. After the Second World War, you couldn't get away with the world on social housing, things like that. People, there wasn't any reaction against social housing in the way that it developed in this country. But people were not as happy with this monolithic organisation. The council, the municipal council, was less happy about having the vast administration. And like in this country, housing associations and work with the council. The difference was that the Viennese authorities kept all the control of their people. Rents were controlled, architectural standards were controlled, and they still went to the top international architects to build their places. They still were going for a wide social mix, so you still had, obviously by now everyone had bathrooms and things, but not just that. We can buy these list of facilities for this one. This is probably the most famous of the latest, newer buildings. It's got a weird name, Alt Erla, E-R-L-A-N, double A at the end. I haven't the foggiest idea what that means, but that's what it's called. It's, again, another of these huge estates, much higher this time, as you can see. Next one, please. Still with the same full provision, store of the city of Vienna. Next, please. If you look at the bottom half of those blocks, they look a bit weird. If we can go back to that's it. These are the balconies, which are sort of stepped out on the sloping part of the building, filled with greenery, to break the shape of it. I can't see it's got any practical use, but it gives greenery and life to the building. Next one, please. The colour of this doesn't go. You see on 6 of the blocks, these sort of patches. Those are swimming pools. So this is social housing with your own private swimming pool on the roof. I think it's a brilliant idea. Next one, please. And this gives you some of the figures. 890,000 apartments for people. Owner-occupied, 160,000. Others, 36,000. Rented to tenants, 693,000. Of which social housing, 400,000. Privately owned apartments, 292,000. Nearly a quarter of a million subject to the full scope of the Tenancy Act. Another 66,000 partially subject to it. 64,000 the old style, going right back to lease agreements and so on and so forth. This is still the picture of Vienna. They've kept it going. They've brought it up to date. They've adapted to modern ideas and so on. But it's still fundamentally a social housing system. And that means that the Viennese government regulates the rents of its buildings and the housing association buildings connected to it. And because there are so many of them, the private landlords can only charge the same fee per day. So housing costs in Vienna are some of the least onerous of any of the major cities in the world. And if we, next one, I think that might be, yeah, that's the last. If we go back to my original point, if you get social housing right and rent right, you've got you're making an enormous contribution to the livability of any city. If you add to that, which we've not touched on today, but really good municipal transport, pleasant, all sorts of facilities to climate. It's not wonderful in Vienna. I mean, you're baking some in freezing winter, but it's quite reasonable. But if you get the things that you can control, then you get a place that's good for you. On a slightly sour note, in the article that was writing about today's or this year's livability survey from the Economist, they were pointing out that the two British cities that had been fairly high in the list had slipped some 10, 12 points down. They hadn't been right at the top in the first place. One was London, the other was Manchester. I think there were some others that was right below those. Those were the two top ones. But in the last 2 or 3 years, both of those cities have gone quite a way down. And, if you think about when and the other health services and so on, it's quite good. So if you can get things like that, just make a huge contribution. And while you can't start with empty ground and wealth taxes in the way that the Viennese do 80, maybe 100 years ago, there is still quite a lot of those aspects that you could actually start taking on board. Decent quality art, decent quality building standards. When you build them well, decent quality maintenance. None of that has been a feature of much of British social. Mainly because the local authorities have been attached to that. So there is a lot of things.
Well, I'm sure there's going to be some questions about this from different directions, so open it up to the audience.
I'm really less sure it's
When I was a youngster, I was in my teens, my father was on the local council in Luton, and he was political auditor. And he was on the housing committee, and he went up to Sheffield when they were building those flats and came back going on about how wonderful they were. He could never understand why there was such a reluctance in Britain to build flats. I mean, that was all he knew. When the housing committee, this was within the late 60s, the housing committee, if you go on well, you won't go on the train from here, but if you went from Sheffield to Luton on that line, you'd go past 3 ghastly power blocks, which Luton Council built very proudly in those days because it was a new thing of building good quality flats for ordinary people that were ordinary and so on. They didn't work because they were just blocks of flats stuck one on top of the other with a desert around them. But they had the power to do it, and they built a lot of other much better stuff. Now a local authority can't build, and they can't even stop people building atrocities.
But it's control with resources.
Yeah.
It's the control to make the decisions, but also the resources to back those decisions with action.
Yeah, but if you're building houses, you take out mortgages. I mean, local authorities, they won't call them anything, but it's effectively mortgages. You took out your mortgage, you had at least 60 years of income coming back from it. So that was a renewable resource. It was affordable. Not on the Viennese scale, but it was affordable. The population of Vienna now is about just somewhere around 2 million. The end of I looked this up because I thought this would come up. I looked this up Around the end of the 19th century, it was under 750,000, and then it jumped in something like 30 or 40 years. That period when I said the seedling were established and there was so much homelessness, it jumped something like 500,000 in something like 30 years. As all the people from the empire flooded in the disruption of the First World War. It's about 2 million now.
My mother's family grew up in Byker, in Newcastle, and they were moved out of their house in the 1980s when the Byker Wall was built. Something you may know about it, but it's a big, long, curved building. I think even now what it was modelled on.
Yeah. It's been hugely influential.
But again, I agree with that observation. That was just flat. There was none of the community add-ons.
Yeah.
It staked around existing pubs and churches and shops, but it didn't add anything that new to build out the rest of that.
By definition, if you're building new estates, you're bringing new people in. They haven't got a community, so you've got to help to create that community.
So the social offer is part of it.
Yeah.
Very definitely big close with the community needs as well.
I mean, if you look at the new towns, I mean, there's Letchworth and places like that, and it's some of them before the Second World War and others after. And Luton had big, they were called London Overspill. It wasn't a new town, but huge new areas of London Overspill to immediately after the war to house the people who had been displaced from bombing and so on. And a lot of those were brought in sort of en masse from particular areas and had that community. And they were. But the new towns, again, different country, you've got the little houses, semis, maybe a few terraces, but the new towns, they were more limited because it wasn't mass housing. They were a brilliant success, I think. And one of my friends lived in Letchworth, and I used to visit, and I knew that quite well. They were a brilliant success, but you needed so much more space because you weren't. One of the principles that the Viennese went for, which I didn't mention, was density. And they got very high densities, but still managed to keep the green spaces and the feeling of spaciousness. There were very good examples of social housing at the end of the 19th century. Israeli was the sort of father of the artisans' dwelling yard. And you know all those our son would call them, those London terraces, 3 bedrooms with an outshot, and those were designed round the artisans' dwelling yard. The artisans' dwelling yard said you've got to have running water. You didn't have to have a loo, you could have a earth in the backyard. But you had to have a running water. And the outshot building at the back, you go past on the train and there's these rows and rows of houses with these bits sticking out of the back. The water pipe went in there. It was the cheapest way of putting the water in. And also the sewage pipe from the privies. So that was 1868.
There's been a political reaction to state housing provision in this country and in other countries. In Vienna, has there been a political backlash? Is it because of the popularity?
I've got a quote here from this nurse that I was quoting at the beginning, if I can find it. I think that's the wrong thing. But there was a Guardian article about this was 2017 when Vienna won the thing again, and they interviewed this nurse. And she was saying, it's wonderful because I can live. It's 20 minutes, 30 minutes to my job, back home again. And she was aware of rents in other places, in other parts of the world. And the rents, this is the thing, the rents on average are somewhere around 20% of an ordinary salary, somewhere between 20 and 25%. In this country, it's renting a grotty little flat can take 50% of an earthly salary. It's
Yes. the costs, the wider costs are, on society, of so much money going into, renting. Yeah, quite significant.
Just looking at the Wikipedia reference for Alcalá, it said it had the highest satisfaction rating in 2008 in the whole of Vienna. Are they still building new ones?
Yeah, I don't think the city builds itself anymore. The city has got very strong connections with some housing associations, less strong ones with others. But even where they've got no direct connections, the regulations mean that the housing associations have got to stick to the principles. And that sort of decent facilities, good architecture, decent standards, and relatively the rents are all controlled. And things like pushing people out because you don't like the look on their faces.
So the model has survived.
The model is going strong. It was, but the council house model in the UK has virtually disappeared because all the council houses were sold. They're very, very, very big. And what's happened now is that you have to have so many problems to be eligible for council house that they've become better.
And the social housing sector in our country has been quasi-privatised by increasing market criteria and using loans to build and to return and get rents back for that.
And some of the housing associations, and some of the things that came up when I was on our planning committee, and I was sort of looking into things, not in Dorchester, but just generally, some of the housing associations, the people who go back into the 19th century as a sort of housing charity, and they have now got buildings where the damp is so bad that it's making people ill. And they are not, you talk to them and they don't do anything about it. Presumably, they're short of money. But, the housing is just boring. I don't know, but they are. Possibly because they're paying their executives to very large sums.
But they don't get subsidised like they did, so they have to borrow money. In fact, they operate in terms of financially, I think, often like developers. So they're paying back on loans for their development.
And also, a lot of housing association buildings now are certainly in London, and some of them, where they're, a lot of the people of the properties are very old, so presumably they're not bringing in very high ones.
Why do people not building in the Why don't they build in the
Because when the council built the houses that they had to sell off after Mrs. Thatcher's ruling and the very full-blooded following of it by all governments since, there was also legislation that they couldn't get the money back. They didn't get the money back. So that money went into government coffers. When Mrs. Thatcher said she was going to make it possible for people to buy their houses, she said the money would go back to the county. It never did. And that means that the capital sum has just been drained out of local authorities. So they're not allowed to borrow. They can't borrow to do. Now, how many of us could buy a house if we couldn't take out a mortgage? Well, local authorities are in exactly the same position. Well, not exactly the same, but in a comparable position. So they can't borrow.
The housing corporation that went to the housing association.
All of that has gone. I mean, local authorities' money overall has been cut by somewhere between 30 and 40% over the last 10 years. And the stuff that they've got to do, like looking after the old people and so on, they've still got these statutory things. And there's just no money.
We're going to have to increase the taxes for people with cars. You're going to go back to
except if you've got electric.
All right. Yeah.
Which the financing of that, I mean, people, the reckoning is that a house has got at least 60 years of life. So, I mean, the councils, they didn't have that money, in the sort of council back pocket. The council took out loans, just like an ordinary mortgage, and they would reckon to get the cost of it back in rents. And I mean, if people were on housing benefit, then they got something from the government, from the tax fund to compensate. So they'd reckon to get the sums back from the rent, from the cost of building and providing, in something like 30 years. So the profit for a lot of houses would last a lot more than 60 years. The profits from the years after the first 30 years would go towards financing the next year. And that was just, that pattern was destroyed by
because there was a long period of political consensus about council housing. It was supported and subsidised and facilitated by both parties.
Does anyone know which which housing minister was responsible for the most council housing starts? I was heckled him when I was about 13. And two elderly diggers in Dorchester. I was in my school uniform on the way back. I knew he was talking in an open air meeting, and I stopped. I went there on my way back from school. And it was the 1959, you'd never had a so good election. And he was going on about how he'd never had it so good. And I brought up one or two doubts, people who might not have been quite such a good position. And a couple of these elderly ladies turned on me and said, you can't vote yet, what are you doing? And Macmillan from his podium said, no, she made a point, let her have her say of it. He actually defended her. Got a soft spot for him. Harold Macmillan would also be hounded out of the Conservative Party today because during the war he actually put up in Birch Grove, his country home. He actually took in refugees. Yeah. And I apologise if I've been a bit polemical, but I do get passionate.
No, it's always good to have a bit of polemical input. We need a bit of political discussion generally. So thank you very much for coming along and providing it, Pauline. The next talk will be in November, and that will be part of the AGM. So that's in, I think, the 7th of November, I think. So notice will go out both in terms of members and also wider social media. And indeed, we might throw things down into Weymouth Civic Society so we can share potential talks as well. So thank you for coming anyway. Thank you, Pauline.